Gordon, and I'm the CEO of the Discovery Museum. And I'd like to welcome you to the fifth event in the 2021 Discovery Museum Speaker Series, which is a series of conversations with expert voices on matters of importance to our communities. The Discovery Museum Speaker Series is always free of charge and open to the public. So I'm really excited for tonight's conversation. From the moment I learned about Sunrise and then learned that the co-founder grew up here in Acton, I knew that this speaker series needed to hear from Varshini, and tonight we will do that. So we have a wonderful turnout tonight, and I want to thank you all for joining us. So a bit of housekeeping. We'll be reserving some time for a question and answer period at the end of the evening. So please submit your questions anytime during the talk using the Q&A button, and we'll address as many of those questions as we are able. You may also use the chat button throughout the presentation. Hopefully tonight's presentation is closed caption, and you can turn that feature on and off at the bottom of your screen. We'll be recording tonight's presentation, and the recording will be available on our website in a few days, and you will personally receive an email with the link and any notes and resources that are referenced during the presentation tonight. So I have two things to share with you before we get on to introducing our guests. First, I'd like to thank our sponsors. So thank you to the organizations whose sponsorship of this series has allowed us to present it free of charge for the 9th year. Our lead sponsor, the Foundation for Metro West, was established in 1995 and is the only community foundation serving the Metro West region of Massachusetts. It promotes philanthropy across the area, helps donors maximize the impact of their local giving, and serves as a resource for all of us in the local nonprofit organizations. And meanwhile, it enhances the quality of life for everyone. Our investor sponsor, Enterprise Bank, is headquartered in Lowell, Massachusetts, with 26 branch locations throughout the Merrimack Valley and north central regions of Massachusetts, as well as southern New Hampshire. They are a true community bank, leading with a deep sense of mission and purpose. Their success is consistently measured by the success of the individuals, businesses, and communities that they enthusiastically serve. We thank the foundation, the bank, and all our generous sponsors for their support. So I also want to tell you just a bit about the Discovery Museum. The Discovery Museum has been serving the children and families of Massachusetts for nearly 40 years. And as I mentioned, this is the 9th year of our Discovery Museum Speaker Series. We're really proud of the series, conversations on topics we know are important to kids and families, especially in these complex and challenging times. In addition to tonight's important topic, we have some upcoming events that will address talking to kids about stereotypes and invisibility of Indigenous peoples, and supporting and empowering the lives of children with disabilities. As I mentioned, for the third time, these events are, as the series has always been, free of charge and open to everyone, thanks to the support of our sponsors. Registration for both of those events is now open on our website. Some of you may not know our museum. We're a family-focused children's museum that emphasizes science, nature, and play. Tonight, I'd just like to focus on one aspect that relates closely to tonight's talk, which is our commitment to sustainability. We launched a sustainability plan earlier this year in which we outlined 29 action steps that span all areas of museum operations. All of those steps are focused on demonstrating and setting an example for others and creating a platform and an environment for learning about sustainability. Anchoring that plan is the installation of 326 kilowatt solar array, which will be on our Acton property here in early 2022. That solar array will enable the museum to be fully solar electric. We will also We also enter into our sustainability work with full knowledge that racial justice is an important topic that we need to be aware of and engaged on. As we expand our work in outdoor, environmental, and sustainability experiences and advocacy, we're committing to doing so in ways that promote equitable access. Finally, and perhaps most relevant to our conversation tonight, we aim to educate all children in and about nature so that they feel inspired to be active and impassioned agents for our climate and for the natural world. Kids who have a daily relationship with the outdoors in their childhood will be more likely to speak up on its behalf as they grow up. So to get started, we are really pleased and excited to have Varshini Prakash with us tonight. We're so excited that she accepted our invitation to inspire everyone. Varshini, nice to see you. And also with us tonight, we have Miriam from WBUR, who's agreed to moderate this conversation. So welcome to you both.
Awesome. Thanks so much. Thank you, Neil.
That's great.
Hello.
Varshini, welcome back to Acton, even though it's virtual.
I'll be there bright and early tomorrow morning. So unfortunately, I'm missing you all, but I'm in my Boston home, so not too far away.
That's great. So if you'll both just bear with me a second, I want to introduce you formally to our audience, and then we'll get started. So our conversation with Varshini tonight will be moderated by Miriam, who's a reporter at WBUR's environmental desk, Earthwhile. So before coming to WBUR, she was a staff writer for the Phoenix New Times in Arizona, and her work has also appeared in Boston Magazine, The Atlantic, Narratively, Dig Boston, and the Big Roundtable. Miriam, thank you for doing this tonight.
Happy to do it. Honored to be here.
Right. And Varshini Prakash is the executive director and co-founder of Sunrise. And as we'll learn tonight, a movement of young people working to stop climate change and create millions of good jobs in the process through the Green New Deal. Varshini has been a leading voice for young Americans, including when she helped lead a mass demonstration for the Green New Deal with Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez that went viral and put the climate crisis at the top of the political agenda in the 2020 elections. Varshini's work has been featured in the New York Times, MSNBC, The New Yorker, on the BBC, in the Washington Post, and more. In 2019, she was named to the Forbes 30 Under 30 list for law and policy, and the Time 100 Next, which is a new list of rising stars who are shaping politics, popular culture, science, and more. And as she points out, she lives here locally in Boston. So welcome to you both tonight, and thank you both for being here. This is great. We're so excited to hear your conversation. I'm going to turn it over now to Miriam to lead a good chat. We'll talk to you guys in a bit.
All right. Thanks, Neil. Hey, Varshini. So
Hey.
I thought a really good way to maybe start this conversation off is to talk about how climate change has felt really, really real this year, maybe in a way it hasn't in the past. And I'm thinking about horrible wildfires out west, and we saw flooding in Europe and China, and here on the East Coast, a lot of hurricanes. Could you just set the stakes for us? Like, what are we talking about when we're talking about climate change and climate activism?
Yeah. Yes. Well, the story that immediately comes to mind when I think of the impacts is one of my friends at Sunrise called me about a month ago, and her name's Michelle, and she called me really concerned. And she said, I haven't even been outside of my house in multiple days. The smoke is so thick, it looks like someone lit off firecrackers in front of my house and left the smoke there permanently. She couldn't walk her dog because they were concerned about asthmatic reactions. There were multiple people in the city who were hospitalized. And now she's asking herself, this place that I grew up in, this place that I love, the mountains that I love, can I afford to be here, to grow old here, to have children here, to put down roots here? Can I afford that? Or do I actually have to leave and migrate out of my own community because of the impacts of the climate crisis? And I just feel like her story hit me so viscerally, because you hear the numbers, you hear about the parts per million in the atmosphere, you hear about the degrees and the fractions of decimal points, and you're like, what does it all mean? And to me, I think it's about our breath. It's about whether we can inhale and have it feel healthy. It's about whether we can drink water and have it feel like it's life-giving. It's about whether we have home that we can call our home, and communities that can stay and be resilient and thrive. It's about whether we can recognize human civilization as we know it, or we cannot, and it changes so catastrophically. And to me, that is what is at stake, is everything about our way of living and being. As you mentioned, we saw Hurricane Ida, just 16 years, literally to the day of Hurricane Katrina, decimate communities, deluge communities that are still rebuilding, lives that were lost. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change sharing that in the groundbreaking report earlier this year, we are set to break the 1.5 degrees Celsius ceiling of warming in the next 5 years, which means we'd be on track to basically rendering a vast majority of sub-Saharan Africa is too hostile to grow food. The destruction of the vast majority of coral reefs across the world. Low-lying nations having to evacuate the vast majority of the people that live there to other places and becoming refugees. Exceeding 417 parts per million this year, which hasn't happened before in human history. It hasn't happened for 4 million years in the history of our world. And so there's a lot at stake, and there's a lot that can be done. And I think the key in all of this is reminding ourselves that quite literally every single decimal point of warming that can be avoided can save the lives of potentially millions of people.
Yeah, I think that's, I love what you said too about it being more than just parts per million, right? This is it's about people, and it's about the air we breathe. So my next question, I wanna back way up for a minute. Do you remember when you first became aware of the climate crisis? Was there a specific event or something you witnessed that kind of woke you up, so to speak? What was that formative moment for you?
Yeah. Well, I feel like I would describe, oftentimes, the experience that people have was, of something really negative happening in your life, or a crisis or something like that. And I sort of, as I've been processing this for myself and asking myself this question over the last few years, have realized that it kind of actually began with a love story. And I grew up, I love the Discovery Museum. First of all, I didn't say this, I should have said this at the beginning, but it makes me so happy to be doing this event, because I grew up as a child and a toddler going to the Discovery Museum. And I drive past it every time I go home, because I grew up a mile away from there in South Acton. And I would spend a lot of time as a kid just mucking around outside, as a 9-year-old, stealing my neighbor's flowers, digging up holes in the yard, moving boulders from one side to another, creating magical fairylands in my best friend's backyard, leading expeditions through the tiny bit of forest behind my house. And I don't know if anybody who's listening has ever had this experience, but I remember spending a lot of time outside when I was younger and being is this God? Did I find God? Is this, because it felt like sheer magic. And I really fell in love with the environment around me. And I think what actually began politicizing me was getting older and realizing that this pristine, beautiful place that I had gotten so much from, so much creativity, imagination, a sense of belonging, a sense of like community and kindred spirit with my friends and the mud and, you know, the trees and all of that was being destroyed. And that our lives were being deeply impacted as a result of that. Hearing about, you know, the pile of trash twice the size of Texas that was sitting in the Pacific Ocean, hearing about people not having food, access to water because, you know, not because we had a problem of, you know, production, but because we had a problem of equity. Seeing people who look like me half a world away already experiencing the impacts of environmental degradation, of corporate greed, of worsening floods and storms, and this feeling of like absolutely feeling enraged at the level of injustice that I was seeing all around me. And this sense of like, how could we not take care of each other? Like, what is the kind of world that I'm growing up in that we are allowing all of this to happen on our watch?
And so
and
what did you do about that? Like, I know you were active in the divestment for a while. Like, how did you turn that into action, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, the funny thing is I didn't know what to do. Like, I felt at that time, I remember watching Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and being like, oh, that's fine. We have we have till 2020 to figure out. I'm sure some responsible adult will figure it out. I'm 14, I can't do it. Clearly that didn't happen. And when I got to college, I, got roped in and pulled into campaigns and activism on campus. I remember feeling like the first time I ever became politically involved, someone asked me to MC a rally that we were holding to make sure that fossil fuel infrastructure didn't come to Western Massachusetts. I went to UMass Amherst for my undergrad, and I was like, okay, I'm nervous, but I'll do it. And they handed me the megaphone, and I prepared for like days. They handed me the megaphone, and I got up there, and all of my nervousness and sense of fear just like dissipated. And I felt for the first time looking out at the sea of like 100 people showing up on a wintry day in the middle of finals week, I felt not alone, and I felt powerful for the first time in my life. And it was the sense of like, I don't have to do this in isolation. I don't have to do this. I don't have to just be like, chasing after people trying to turn off light bulbs or like being a recycling freak. Like, I can actually band together with people to run campaigns that could topple some of the most powerful industries in the world that are destroying our environment and our communities. And so I just fell in love with this concept of organizing, this concept of everyday people being able to band together and build power and do extraordinary things because the sum of our actions is greater than our individual selves. And so I helped run the divestment campaign, and over the course of 3 years, we engaged thousands of young people. We did banner drops, we did rallies, we did demonstrations. And actually in 2016, sort of at the culmination of this campaign, after about like 34 people were arrested on campus for civil disobedience, protesting the university's investment policies in coal, oil, and gas, we actually won that campaign. And it was this sense of, wow, like young people can make such a huge difference in the world, especially if we are willing to speak truth to power and willing to fight and not take no for an answer.
Yeah, and I think we should just point out for our listeners too that divestment campaign continues to this day. And today, Boston University just announced it was divesting from fossil fuels. Harvard announced the other week it was going to. So,
yes,
young people.
And it's so, and a lot of those folks who are running the BU campaign, the Harvard campaign, those were my contemporaries while I was an undergrad. Like, these campaigns have been running for a decade in some places, and it goes to show like, people will always laugh at you. They'll tell you it's unrealistic. They'll say an institution like Harvard will never do it. But frankly, it was sheer good organizing and determination that ultimately made it happen.
Yeah. I think also, so I'm just thinking back to like when I first became aware of the Sunrise Movement. And I'm pretty sure, like a lot of people, it was in 2018 when you guys occupied Nancy Pelosi's office, right? But the movement actually goes back earlier than that. Can you tell us the story of how it started? How did you meet with your co-founders? How did you guys decide to form this group?
Yeah. So it goes back a little before, but not too much, not too much more. We launched in 2017, in summer of 2017. And, you know, essentially, I'd say a lot of the rationale for coming together to start Sunrise was a cohort of young people looking at the reality of the climate crisis, realizing how far we were as a nation from stopping it, realizing how little political power young people have in this country to really shift where the nation, the direction of the nation. This was, you know, the rise of Donald Trump and inevitably, like eventually Donald Trump becoming president of the United States, and this, you know, the very idea of federal climate legislation going out the window for 4 years, and the realization that young people in this country who are freaked out about the climate crisis, who want to do something about it, have no political home to go to get trained, to meet their peers and organize together. And so for about a year prior to 2017, this cohort of young people, which I was a part of, who had been active in divestment campaigns, international climate efforts, et cetera, collaborated and underwent basically like an intensive year-long research and planning process to develop Sunrise. And so we figured out, like, what's the strategy for the next 4 years? What's a story that we can tell about our work? What's the structure that we need to bring in potentially thousands of new members into our movement? And we launched in the summer of 2017, essentially with a goal of making climate action that was rooted in racial and economic justice a core priority in American politics.
And I'm just curious too, you said a lot of you guys knew each other from existing campaigns. Why start a new group? Like, what was the void that you were hoping to fill with Sunrise?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it is difficult to overstate how, I don't know what the word is, maybe like allergic to, afraid of, didn't want to deal with, like people really did not want to engage with political power, like did not want to engage with elections, didn't want to engage with the federal government, didn't believe that it was possible to change anything at that level. And I think seeing the way in which candidates like Bernie Sanders were actually able to motivate and activate millions of young people while talking about the climate crisis was really animating for us. And we realized, like, wow, there is so much power on the table that young people are leaving behind right now. We could have a voice in politics, and yet we're choosing to sort of sit on the sidelines. And why not, you know, instead of railing against people who don't hold our values and who don't espouse our vision, why not put our people in government, and why not support them to pass legislation at the highest levels of government, in Congress and in the presidency? And so that was like the biggest, I would say one of the biggest shifts, was really wanting to centralize political power as a core component of how we understand winning on climate change.
Yeah. Have you been surprised by how it took up, or did you sort of expect it to happen? Like,
I don't think anyone expects that to happen, but I think we were like, in our wildest dreams, this is what we want, and this is what we would hope for our movement. And it was thrilling and terrifying when it happened all at once. And yeah, I mean, in many ways, we knew, like, we were planning for it in a sense. We knew, I mean, a lot of the purpose of why we engage in civil disobedience and direct action, and why we do things like demonstrations and protests and, you know, like the events that happened at Nancy Pelosi's office, is in large part because we know that civil disobedience is really about sort of bringing the crisis that people are facing in their communities and putting it out on the national stage and forcing people to really make a choice about whether you're going to continue to stand by the sidelines while this injustice is continuing, or whether you're going to get in the game. And in that moment, I think the action at Pelosi's office, where you see these super powerful young people sharing their stories, you see these signs that say, like, what is your plan to stop the climate crisis? You see images, this was right after the last IPCC report came out. So, the report that said we have basically 12 years, now 9, to move our entire global system to decrease emissions by 50%, that was really activating for a lot of people and resulted in basically like tens of thousands of folks coming in out of the woodwork and the creation of like hundreds of new chapters for Sunrise.
Awesome. And you just mentioned stories again, and we kind of started off talking that way. And one thing that's been really interesting to me as a reporter covering the youth climate movement is how much of a focus there is on personal storytelling. Every young person I've met has thought really deeply about how climate change impacts them or someone they know. People practice telling stories. And I wonder, why this focus on storytelling, and was it intentional, and does it fundamentally accomplish something different than like stats about sea level rise and parts per million of carbon in the air?
Totally. Yeah. No, it's a great question. I mean, I think that as humans, we are way more guided by what we feel and how we connect to people than the intellectualization of these crises. Like, I know at a heart level, when I hear about the impact of the climate crisis on somebody, it is so much more impactful to me than it is when I just hear numbers about what's going on in their lives. And so stories, in a big sense, are one, a way to connect to each other. It's a way to relate to one another. It's a way to understand each other, especially as we're trying to build this new movement that can bring together people of color, people from different class backgrounds, people from different geographies. Connecting to values and connecting to emotions is a way that we can actually relationally connect to one another. And I think is like really at the heart of also supporting young people to develop, supporting anybody to develop their stake in why they care about this crisis. You have a lot more skin in the game if you can really articulate, like, how is my family impacted by this? Who are the people that I love that are impacted by this? How is the place that I love impacted by this? And if you can share that story, not only is it animating to other people and connecting to other people, but it's also a way of keeping yourself in the fight during days that can be deeply demoralizing or really scary, or a future that's super uncertain. And I think like that love is honestly what grounds us ultimately.
Do you find that politicians are receptive to that? Do you feel like there's a difference if you tell a story than like tell them we have, X number of years until it's the end of the world?
That's a good question. I find that it's not just stories that are really appealing to politicians. I think one of the biggest things that's appealing to politicians is power. And I think we could tell all of the stories that we wanted in the end, but ultimately whether we can win or lose an election, or whether we can like organize thousands of their constituents to be out in the streets and calling for action is equally as important. And so, I think stories are critical, and we use them primarily as a tool for organizing and connecting with one another and growing our numbers. And I think with politicians, absolutely, like connecting to people's values and connecting to what people's self-interest is and their stake in the fight is super important. And equally as that, it's not just like pleading and making the case, it's also, can we walk the walk around the fact that we are building a powerful youth organization that you want and have an interest in allying with.
Yeah. So another observation I've had, and this is kind of, we haven't had too many big political rallies in the last year and a half, right? But
Yeah.
prior to the pandemic, if you went to a youth climate march or demonstration, let's say like here in Boston, you'd see a really diverse group of people. And, from demographic data that the younger generation in this country is much more diverse than previous generations. Could you talk a little bit about the role that that plays in the climate movement? Does it matter? Is it a strength? How does that make an impact?
Yeah. Oh, well, I mean, Gen Z is the most diverse generation. And that is like absolutely true of if you see the high schoolers that are coming into Sunrise, they are the most diverse group of folks that are coming in right now. But I think what it ultimately does is it is not an option to talk about the climate. It wasn't an option before, but it's definitely not an option now to fail to talk about the climate crisis in terms that are equally about racial justice. It is not an option to not share and account for in our policies that we're publicly fighting for internally to deeply address the ways in which this crisis is impacting people with different backgrounds. And that like fighting for a movement that actually incorporates all people and fighting for policies that incorporates all people is a central tenet to how we solve the climate crisis. And to me, it is also, frankly, impossible to solve the climate crisis without accounting for racial justice. When you look at the folks who are suffering the most, like earlier this year, meeting with folks in Louisiana and Cancer Alley, who just like, half of their community is riddled with cancer because of petrochemical plants in the community. There are also flooding because of the climate crisis, or farmers in Iowa that are struggling with the corporate agriculture system and how that's killing local farmers. It is impossible to solve the climate crisis without deeply understanding the impacts that that has on poor and working and Black and Brown Americans. And so I think I've seen the younger generation of folks come in just being really unapologetic about that and honestly not understanding how we could exist in any other way and seeing these issues as intrinsically connected in a way that that the climate movement that I grew up in or like got politicized in, it was not at all as sort of intuitive for folks.
Yeah. And do you think that there's like, I feel like I could imagine a lot of young people saying, I didn't know I could get involved, but I see people who look like me out there on the street, or, I see Varshini on TV, or does that, have people said things like that too? Does that?
Yeah, that's the best thing. That's the best thing in the world is like, I mean, it is, some days it is really grueling. It is really hard. It's really painful. You feel like you're failing. You don't know if like you're doing the right thing at any given moment. And especially now that this organization has grown big and has a public presence, it's like, it's hard to know that every next step that you'll make will be the right one, or whether you're truly equipped to solve the climate crisis. And it's really daunting. And I think the thing that frequently is the anchor that keeps me in is feeling like I am consistently either a role model for, or just am like helping, like giving a helping hand up to more young, particularly women of color, who are finding a voice or seeing someone in leadership, especially like in the climate and environmental movement, that looks like them, that's like able to be loud, able to speak their mind, able to stand in leadership, and also like manage what leadership means and grow through that experience. And yeah, I mean, I do it all for the kids. Like every action I take, I feel like I'm like, what's the kind of leader that I want these kids to look up to and feel like they want to emulate or be better than, frankly. And yeah, I think those are the moments that feel really magical.
And that's actually a good segue into another question I have, which is that I feel like we can't have this conversation without talking about climate grief or climate anxiety. I know there are a lot of people in the audience tonight who either have young kids or who work with young kids, and this is a really big concern. I read a story this morning about a new study of, I think it was like tens of thousands of young people across 10 countries in the world. And over 60% of kids said that they were worried or very worried about climate change. And 45% said that those feelings impact their day-to-day life, right? That anxiety sits with them every day. So one, like, does this ring true to you? Like, do you see this when you're meeting people and talking with people? And then, like, what do you tell them? Like, what advice do you have for kids, for parents, for people who are worried about climate anxiety?
Oof. I see this a lot. We'll see kids, just consistently kids who are struggling to just exist because it feels really hard to make decisions about your future, or kids who are scared to have children because in the future, because they don't know what kind of world will exist for them. Kids who are going through like really severe anxiety and depression because the problem just feels so big and immense, and it feels really hard to know what your part is and how to be powerful in that moment and find your own agency. And I mean, we have a lot of kids who just are like, I can't even see myself going to college or having an opportunity like that, where I feel like there's so much work to be done and this is where I need to do it. I'm not encouraging that. I just have seen a higher rate of it than I was honestly even anticipating. And there's no easy answer. I think the biggest thing that I've noticed is the vast majority of folks are not talking about it. They're not talking about how it feels, not just the news reports, not listening to it on, the radio or the news, not reading science reports, not like just doom scrolling on Twitter, but really talking about it, like getting in your feelings about it, sitting with the discomfort of, I'm scared, I'm freaked out, I don't know what to do. It feels really uncertain. I can't plan my life around this. And like fully engaging with the vulnerability of what it means to live at this really intense time in human history. And so that's like, number one, I mean, people just got to talk about it. And especially if you have younger kids, like they know what's up. My partner has a younger sister, and when she was 4 or 5 years old, she would be, she would watch my videos on like Facebook and stuff. And all of a sudden she'd be talking about like the people in India who are experiencing climate disaster, or she'd be talking about the need to take climate action and why that's so important. And these kids are understanding at such an early age. And I think engaging with them through that rather than pretending like it's not happening is really critical. And then I think the biggest antidote to anxiety and fear, in my opinion, is action. And not like fear-fueled action, but grounded action that's like fueled by love and that's fueled by your stake in your community. And I don't know where I'd be in the world if I weren't putting my, if I just weren't putting my time and energy towards solving this problem and engaging with a community that every day is also asserting themselves at that task. Have you found that, I feel like you talk to so many people who are impacted by this issue. I'm curious if anything has come up for you.
Yeah, I think I definitely meet people who have a lot of climate anxiety. I think as a climate change reporter, there are days where I wake up too, where I'm just like it hits me in a way that, it might not otherwise. And I think what you said about action rings true, right? For me, what I do to take action is I cover the crisis, right? I tell people stories and I try to help people translate. But yeah, it's very real. And I think it's I think it's great that you guys talk about it. And
Yeah.
I've seen that at events that I've gone to, that it's, there's an emphasis on action, but also an emphasis on taking care of each other and community, and recognizing that like this work that you're doing is really taxing and be really emotionally draining.
Totally. And I mean, something just for parents also that I'm thinking about, I'm not a parent, but I don't know, this would be helpful if I was a kid. But how I feel like, what are the resiliency practices that we're really instilling in our kids? Like, how are we supporting our kids to go through the hard stuff and not shy away from it, but also have practices of resiliency that we are embedding in their lives? For me, that looks like a daily meditation practice. And I'll say, like, I really learned that from my mom. I mean, kudos to her. I don't know if she's on here, but that was extremely helpful for me. A practice of just, even just being able to talk to your friends and have a community that, always has your back, even if it's one or two people. And I think thinking through, like, what are the practices around resiliency for yourself and also for your kids that you can instill that allow for them to actually cope and process the world and move through, so they're not just spiraling. Like, part of the issue is people just spiral in the shame and don't know how to get out of it. And so they shy away from it. Not the shame, sorry, the fear and the grief. And how can we be supporting people to identify the things that help them feel like they can be back and grounded in life, and that life is worth living. Dancing, singing, animals, nature, all of that.
Yeah, I think also, this is just making me think, there's always this big debate about how do we frame the climate crisis? Do we frame it like doom and gloom, and that will get people to respond? Or do we frame it in a more positive light, like here's what we can do, and that would, keep people from getting too cynical or inspire them to take action? I'm curious where you land on that, and maybe it's both, right? Like, maybe different people respond to different things, but where do you land, and what in general has been the Sunrise movement's philosophy towards that?
Yeah. I think the general sense that we've had around it is, fear mongering and extreme urgency is demoralizing and debilitating for people. When I hear we have 6 months to figure it out, I'm like, oh God, I can't even, forget it. I can't even do this. I'm just going to go home and, I don't know, work on a farm or something for the rest of my life. I'll just retire early since it's all going to shit anyway. And at the same time, sort of positivity that's shallow and optimism that is shallow, that is actually just a cover up for fear, is not helpful either. And how can we balance a real reckoning with the urgency and emergency of the moment, and speak in plain terms? We do not have a lot of time. People are experiencing the impacts. We can do a lot to stop it, and communicate a real resolve and clarity and a hope for the future that is grounded in action that we are collectively going to take. And so I'd say it's both. And I've seen movements in the past, I've seen the environmental movement really actually do both of those things. The bad things of both, we're totally screwed. Everyone just, it's complete despair mode. The polar bears are all drowning, even though, yes, it's very bad. They are. And also, we're going to solve this crisis. We got everything we need. We're rock stars, that actually feels shallow and doesn't feel like reckoning with the reality of what's happening. So I'd say it's both. And I think urgency and hope combined can be an extremely potent and meaningful force to bring people together.
Yeah, I come down in the same way as you. So another question kind of about framing. So in your view, has media coverage of the Sunrise movement or Greta Thunberg or just the youth climate movement in general, Has that changed over the last few years? And if so, how? I mean, at the beginning, like, do you feel like you guys were taken seriously? Where does that stand now?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Wow. I mean, well, at the beginning, we were not taken seriously. Let's be clear about that. At the beginning, people were like, why are these kids being mean to Democrats? Like, just go after Republicans. What's your problem? Like, people really didn't understand the strategy. And I think after a while, it became clear, okay, yeah, like it's, you can have a Joe Biden, you could have a Barack Obama. There's still a ton of work to be done to solve the climate crisis that requires exerting political pressure. And that might not be the same as a resistance that you might have to a Donald Trump, who is quite literally a climate change denier, but we still have a role and a responsibility to be taking action to push for climate action that is commensurate to the scale of the crisis, which we are nowhere near taking action at that level. I'd say the media has.
You're like taken seriously in a way that you weren't early on, right? Like you thought
Yes,
always like
yeah.
realistic and
Totally. I mean, I do think I think it's a dangerous. I think what has happened is we are far more a fixture of American politics and a prominent voice in American politics than we have been before. I don't want to make the mistake of comparing that entirely to what it means to have the power to fully enact your vision. And I think that actually comes frequently. It both comes from your media and your narrative, but it also comes predominantly from the amount of power that you're building on the ground in your organizing effort. And so that's why I'm like, I think there are ways in which we are taken far more seriously in American media, and at the same time, frequently we're posited as sort of like a character in the like ping pong of American politics. And at this like level of like the tactics and the machinations of everything that's happening on the Hill, and far less are reporters in the media, I would say, commenting on the role of social movements and understanding what social movements do and the role of them in American history. Or I've seen a real I see this across, I see it with media, I see it with funders, I see it with people outside of our sphere, like in advocacy realm and other places of not totally understanding the role that social movement organizations play in civil society. And constantly wondering, like, why are you pushing for that thing? Like, why is that, that's too ambitious? Or, why are you guys doing protests or demonstrations? Wouldn't it be better to just like have meetings with politicians or things like that? And I've seen a lack of information sometimes in that realm.
Yeah, that makes sense. Kind of shifting gears a minute. So the Sunrise Movement formed during Donald Trump's presidency, and you were very vocal during the 2018 midterms and the lead up to the 2020 election. But now we have a president who, though he hasn't endorsed the Green New Deal in name, clearly takes climate change seriously and is attempting to respond to the crisis. What is the role of youth activism or in the Sunrise Movement in the Biden administration?
Yeah, so a lot of the way that I think about how our role has shifted is during the Trump administration, our primary focus was resistance, right? It was stopping the bad, and it was building up public support, like support and opinion, positive public opinion around for the need for climate action, as well as like electing a suite of candidates that when we would have a different president could enact a plan around the climate crisis that would meet the scale and enormity of the crisis. And I'd say our role under the Biden administration in a big way has shifted from resistance to figuring out okay, how do we govern? How do we participate in the project of figuring out how to govern?
Mhm.
And to me, the main difference between Trump and Biden is that, you know, with Trump, there was basically, if anything, you were losing ground. There was no gaining ground on basically anything when it came to federal legislation. It was essentially entirely defensive and losing ground. But what a Biden administration, frankly, any Democratic administration would have offered us would have been the capacity to have a political terrain on which we could fight. And that wasn't a guarantee of literally anything, but it would allow us the capacity to fight. And so when I think about it, I'm like, you know, currently in this moment, we are in a very rickety, I don't know, some sort of vehicle that we are moving towards to pass climate action. We have this bipartisan infrastructure deal that, frankly, if passed in isolation, might be even worse for the climate. And we have this reconciliation package that could be potentially put out, you know, $3.5 trillion of investments, many of which would be climate and economic and racial justice friendly, and move forward a lot of our goals. And there are a lot of folks who have been corrupted by industry, have close ties to the fossil fuel industry. We have politicians who, you know, like that bipartisan deal, it came out that a lot of the folks who were a part of crafting it were actually also having meetings with companies like ExxonMobil. And so, you know, this moment has made clear, like, nothing is guaranteed, even under a Democratic presidency. We still have to exert pressure. We still have to do our advocacy. We still have to do our direct action. We still have to do our lobbying. We still have to put the pressure on an administration, even if they're Democratic, in part because the forces against us are so high and have been so high for so long.
Are there people, do you guys get this often though, where people be like, Varshini, you got the Democrat in office now, like just go the party line and like go with what Biden is saying, like why push for this other thing? Like, is that real?
I'm sure our legislative team probably gets more of this than I do, but yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there has been a marked shift in the last few years, in part because, you know, with the rise of Black Lives Matter, with Occupy, with Indivisible in the aftermath of Trump, with the immigrant rights movement, with the movement against gun violence, like so many organizations and civil society, we've really had like so many organizations and movements pop up, and this new spring of activity that has happened, that I think it is, people are understanding the role of movements a little bit more than, say, I think in the Obama administration. Absolutely, that would have been like the first thing that we were hearing. But yeah, I think, and we've had to be very, very clear, our role is to create the political space in American society for Joe Biden to actually enact the vision of, to enact the plan that he has proposed, which is the very like foundation and you know, beginning of what we need to do to solve the climate crisis. And so I think like making that clear to people consistently has been a key part also of like the education that Sunrise has had to do.
That makes sense. Again, shifting gears here. So early on in the pandemic, I remember that there were just like a ton of articles that came out that were really likening the response to COVID to climate change, right? Like we can mobilize as a society, as a government, as a civil society to fight this pandemic, maybe we can do the same for climate change. And I wonder if you think in the last year and a half, the conversation has shifted in a fundamental way about climate change, and if that's related to the pandemic.
Oh, I sort of want to ask you this question. I don't, you know, I really don't know that it has. Like, I think I sort of feel like we missed an opportunity. I'm not sure. I mean, I think, okay, here's what I think may have come out of it. I think what COVID made clear was that there are a ton of cracks in American society. There are cracks in our economy. The impacts of the pandemic economically were disproportionately hitting Black and Brown communities. The health inequities that exist in this country were glaringly obvious. The effect of polarization in this country was glaringly obvious in our ability to literally like solve a health, issue. And I think it made really clear that in order to solve and then the uprisings, of course, that happened in the summer of last year, I think just totally blew open the lid on the fact of like how far this country has to go to really realize a nation that is by and for all people. I think the key that came out of that was this need for, if we want to solve this economic crisis, if we want to solve this racial inequity and the health inequities that exist in this country, we need massive investment back into the hands of working people. And we need to massively invest in social services, in our infrastructure, and in our future. And the last few decades of basically like austerity measures of squeezing our public institutions, of squeezing our social services, of failing to invest in our shared goods and public infrastructure has really, really hurt people. And I think it forced, a person like Joe Biden, who's like, like all about being the moderate candidate and moving in moderation, to propose a $3.5 trillion economic recovery package that significantly moves us forward in solving the climate crisis. And that is the power of movements, but also this moment around COVID and how it laid bare the issues that exist in our society.
Yeah. And I would say too, I think, at least from where I sit, I think the pandemic sort of forced people to confront their own mortality in a way that they hadn't before. And as you said, it laid bare a lot of the inequities that exist and that people have been saying climate change is going to exacerbate. And like here you had it in like literal death tolls of, who was dying where and proportions. So change happens at a lot of different levels of society, as we've talked about. And I think that we often focus a lot on federal level change, like we've mentioned, the infrastructure bill a couple of times and the reconciliation bill. And like that makes sense, right? We're talking about trillions of dollars in policies that will affect all of us here in this country. But important changes also really happen at the state and local level. And I'm thinking, specifically here in Massachusetts, we passed this like huge climate law this year. There are a lot of cities and towns in the area that are doing things to encourage greener buildings. If you were to give advice to a young person today who wanted to know, like, where should I focus my attention? What would you say?
Yes, great question. Well, first off, join Sunrise and we will help you answer that question wherever you are. But no, for real, I think the key is trying to figure out like, who's your community? Who are your people? Do you live in a small town or a big city? Do you go to school? Are you in college? Are you in high school? Do you have a place of work? And I think the key there is figuring out like, what are the core changes that can be made in that community that would go the mile to helping stop the climate crisis? Because I super agree with you. There is, the federal stuff is very important because we frankly can't solve the climate crisis without getting the federal government in action. And I don't think we can implement any of the changes that happen at the federal level if local and state and city governments are not behind them 100% of the way. And so over the next, we're actually in this really exciting period in Sunrise where we are reformulating our strategy for the next 5 years. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about is what would it look like to do a Green New Deal for public education or for education so that anybody in any school, middle schoolers, high schoolers, college students could look at their university and, push their university towards ensuring that there is healthy, sustainable local food, ensuring that the buildings are moving towards 100% clean energy, ensuring that people don't have lead in their water and in their walls. And so I would say, the Green New Deal for education and thinking through like, how could I put pressure or, bring a plan around advocating for greater action at the campaign, at the campus level, impact my community could be a really awesome way to figure that out. There's also, in that same vein, we're trying to figure out how to formulate campaigns that mirror what's happening at the federal level, also at the local level. So can you put pressure on your local mayor or, joining together with other young people and asking for, there's a bunch of, there's like 5 million things that you could do, but the same kind of thing, like retrofitting and building, weatherizing buildings and creating accessible public housing, investing in public transit, and so on and so forth. And so that's something that if you're interested in weighing in on and helping to craft, we're actually in the process of formulating those campaigns over the next 4 months, and we'll be launching with them in early 2022.
Wow, I look forward to reading that. And just on that note, I wonder too, like, what I hear you saying is like, you can do all of them, right? Like I could see how putting pressure at the federal level and being part of a nationwide march today for a Green New Deal is empowering and builds the sense of community. And at the same time, maybe what you do next week is work on this local initiative because, like, guess what? You can actually get the mayor to listen to you. Is that what I'm saying? Hearing you say, like, there's this balance.
Yeah, and they all feed into each other. Like, Congress people are paying a lot of attention to what's happening in their district. So if mayors and city council people are hearing a ton from constituents about climate change, that information is also getting to potentially your congressperson, and they're feeding into each other. So I'd say we need to be taking action at all levels of government. It's just, what is the thing that's like feeding you most and what do you want to get involved in? And that's the place where you should start.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to be cognizant of everyone's time. So we're going to move to Q&A and take some audience questions. So we got a lot of questions about what an individual can do. And it was, sometimes it was often framed like, people are idling their cars too much or flying too much. And what can we do to inspire individuals to take action? And I want you to talk about this, but I also want us to be sort of like aware of the role that certain powerful industries have played in getting us to believe that individuals are largely responsible for climate change and that individual action is going to be enough to solve it. But if you want to talk about the role of individuals.
You just said what I was going to say. So, oh man, let's think. How do I want to talk about this?
Because like both can be true, right?
Yeah. I mean, I feel you in the frustration. Like I was that kid. I would like chase my mom around the house, turn off all the lights. Like all my friends, when they would throw their milk carton like in the trash instead of the recycling, would like look at me with just sheer fear in their eyes. And I was like, oh my God, I'm really that friend.
I was that girl.
Yeah. And I think the thing that organizing has really taught me is, one, it's not about shaming people and making people feel bad for their actions. It's about how can you actually communicate a mutual self-interest. Like frequently people aren't being malicious when they do the things that they do. They're just making choices that they either might not be aware of, or, you know, like no one's actually sat down and talked to them about the, you know, why it matters. So that's one thing. I think in all things, we should remove shame and blame from everything that we do, because I just don't think it's motivating. And I think it is the route to disconnection, not connecting with people and moving them to action. And then secondly, I'd say it is absolutely true that if, you know, all of us took these personal consumer actions, there would be changes in the world. And frankly, there is just, having looked at this problem inside and out over the last few years, there is just not action that we can collectively take. It doesn't matter how well you recycle or how many light bulbs you turn off or how many electric vehicles you try to buy. Like, we just cannot actually move at the speed and scale of what this crisis is requiring of us, because there are massive industries, as Miriam mentioned, that are profiting, frankly, that are profiting off of keeping the status quo what it is and burning fossil fuels and producing plastics and a you know, terrible corporate agriculture monoculture system. And also, we need the full might of the government to put resources, money, staff, and move the entire country to action if we're going to solve this problem. And so, to me, the greatest thing that individuals can do is get civically engaged, is like not just making individual consumer choices, but also, in addition to that, getting organized, working with people locally, changing policies, changing government, you know, producing your own food, or actually like manifesting these systems that you want to see in the future in your own life, and in your own community. And so I'd say that's like the number one thing that I always say. And we need to make that kind of change happen at a systems level, not just at the individual level.
Totally. And on that note, someone else has asked, from everything that I read and hear, it doesn't really matter what sort of personal or community changes we make if we continue to depend on fossil fuels the way that we do. How is Sunrise working with Indigenous leaders or other people around the country to address this?
Yeah, totally. I think that's a great point. And I think for us, a lot of the way that we are working in coalition and in partnership is, well, I mean, we have a number of partnerships across the country, everything from the federal, national level to the local level. And we work with networks like the Green New Deal Coalition, which is comprised of racial justice and Indigenous and environmental justice organizations and political organizations, a couple labor unions, youth organizations like Sunrise, and climate and environmental organizations and some big greens. And our sense is we really can't get that much done in the public arena if we're not willing to work alongside others to make that happen. And as we're in this transformation of setting a new strategy, a big part of that is also asking for input from a lot of people. We're going to be reaching out and talking to over like 1,000 people basically over the course of 3 months to get people's input on the strategy. And a big component of that will be asking our greatest allies who are in racial and economic and environmental and Indigenous organizations to give us input on that strategy and how they see us working with them in the broader ecosystem.
Totally. How should a young person, maybe a teenager, get started in climate activism? And maybe like in particular, a shy person who, I don't know, might be nervous to go to a big protest or meet, go to an organizing event with 100 people that they've never met. What are some?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love this question. This is so right. Demonstrating, protests, whatever, big meetings, they're not for everyone. That's totally okay. I think the key here is just remembering, like, begin. Like, the number one most important thing is to begin. And even if it's the smallest thing, like I started with just, having conversations with people and collecting signatures, or I started like a little club at my school, whatever the small thing that just gets you active and meeting people is the number one most important thing. And so something that we're thinking about doing in Sunrise is actually creating like a way that people can digitally take action. So this could be online, whether it's like sending letters or messages to Congress people and doing advocacy or writing letters to the editor. That's a great way. A lot of times actually, like, local news gets really and local politics gets really impacted by letters to the editor in your local news outlet or things like that. And so that could be one option. And so I'd say, feel free to jump into, if you go to sunrisemovement.org, that's one way to just join and keep abreast of everything that's happening. But I'd say at the local level, join a local organization that might be a little smaller and not be doing as many protests or big things like that, or just opt out of those. There's plenty of rules for people to, maybe you could be someone that drives people to these events or cooks, or like, what are your gifts and talents and what do you love to do and how can that be in the service of the movement? That's like the question to be asking yourself. Write letters to your congressperson or local city council people. If you're like passionate about an issue that you see in your community, there's so many things. And I think any smattering of that would be great to get started with, and doesn't require, talking to too many people.
Cool. And I'll make a little plug for WBUR's opinions blog called Cognoscenti, where we love to get pieces from young people. So if you are a young person or you know someone who is young and has something to say, pitch us.
I love that.
But another question that came in is, what lessons, if any, do you take from earlier youth political action, like during the Vietnam War?
Oh, nice. A lot. Okay, so I would say like a lot of our primary, I actually have, someone just is reading about the Vietnam War and youth political action around that. And I'm not an expert in it by any means, but I've been meaning to, so that's a good reminder. But a lot of it, I think the inspiration has primarily come from the civil rights movement. The level of courage, the level of discipline, the level of like willingness to risk life, comfort, so much just for the benefit of all people, and particularly the Black community, I feel like is like a huge thing that I have gained inspiration from just reading more about this, SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and other youth organizations of the time. And I think, oh man, I don't even know where to start. But I think SNCC was a big inspiration, and we ran like several summer programs trying to model it off of Freedom Summer that they ran. I think there's a lot of influence from the immigrant rights movement and the big demonstrations that happened in the 2000s. I think ACT UP, which was the movement against HIV/AIDS in the latter half of the last century, was a big inspiration too, just in terms of like what it means to, they just had really creative actions and really actions that were really captivated the American public and made the issue an issue of life and death when like thousands and thousands of people were dying virtually, like without it being even a conversation in the public discourse. So those are some of the like biggest inspirations. And then I think more historically / less youthy, learning more about like Gandhian revolutionary movements, the Serbian revolutionary movement, which was also, actually that was youth led in a lot of ways, but kind of those were some of the movements that were more at the foundation as we were embarking on starting Sunrise.
Yeah, and one thing that strikes me as you're talking to is like a huge thing that's different now than existed in any of those movements, and this is going to be like the most cliche thing I ever say, like the existence of social media.
Yeah.
And I wonder if, like, what would the Green do? I mean, would Sunrise be what it is today without Twitter and Instagram and, you know, Facebook, whatever the kids are using these days?
Not Facebook. I mean, I think it's an impossible question to answer because like I have no idea, but probably, I mean, it would be a lie to say that it wasn't a big part of how we organize. And in a lot of that is just like finding, I mean, so for example, like Jamal Bowman's race, that was New York 14 when he won against a several decade year incumbent in that district, right next to AOC's district. He, you know, we were able to make like 850,000 calls for Jamal Bowman out of his like 1.3 million, in part because it was like kids on Zoom who came in through the movement through the internet and heard about it and wanted to get involved. And, you know, I think it's like using social media and the internet is like a key way to bring people in and turn that online action into, or turn that like absorption into actual action is really, really key. And then it's like, I think the challenge now these days is like, how do you make sure that it doesn't just become collectivism? Like it's not just following on Twitter, or it's not just being on our email list or things like that, but we're actually organizing those folks offline in their communities, building real relationships and real power. And so that's kind of like a big question that we're tackling and, you know, wrangling with, what's the word? Whatever it is. Wrestling with, that's what it is, wrestling with right now.
I think wrangling would have worked. But so a lot of what we've talked about tonight has been organizing for change. And I wonder on a personal level, how has organizing changed you?
Great question. Oh, so many ways. I mean, I think being a part of this organization and just this work has challenged me to grow faster than I think I would have ever grown before. Being thrown into leadership and being like, all right, swim. And then just being surrounded by what I would describe as like a very heartful community, like a community that leads as much with our hearts as with our heads. A community that is deeply, like unapologetically visionary and pushes for what we believe is necessary, not what we believe is possible. That is like, I have made more mistakes in my life than I ever thought I could make. And I like was a perfectionist when I was, I was like so scared of failure when I was 16. And I was like, I have failed so many times in the last 4 years. I'm almost like embarrassed to talk about it. And I think it has like equipped me with a sense of resilience that I never thought I didn't even know I needed. And yeah, it's just like, I think more than anything, the community, like you just meet a group of people who are so wholehearted, who are so passionate, who are so like doggedly about winning and who just care about each other. And it's a really beautiful community. I feel extremely blessed to be a part of it.
Yeah, and I think maybe for our last question, bringing it back to where we all started, what role do you believe organizations that serve and teach children, like a children's museum, should have in this conversation? How can they use their collective power to help lead our way out of this crisis?
Oh, that's, wow. I want to ask you guys that question. You know, I really think it's such a struggle to get places where people are even willing to have this conversation with kids and in schools in a way that isn't just like wrong and factually incorrect. And I think it's just really powerful that you're having this conversation and are able to bring this, you know, in a different way, but bring this conversation to young people. I think being able to have places like the Discovery Museum, which I feel like was such a, like, to be able to do problem solving and employ creativity to the process of dealing with climate change and environmental issues is just such a liberating way to deal with the issue rather than just like feeling doom and gloom around how bad it is. And I think you all are specifically well positioned to like figure out how to support young people to think about it in that way. And I just think you're like a fixture of the community. Like everybody who would come visit us who had young kids would go to the Discovery Museum. Like everybody I knew went to the Discovery Museum in my, you know, elementary school years. And yeah, like the messages that you share and the hope that you share and the stories that you share matter. And like kids really hold on to that. And who knows, like I feel like some of those experiences that I had when I was a kid really have like shaped why I am where I am today. And that could be you for a whole host of kids coming through.
Love that. Thank you so much. This has been such a fun conversation. Neil, I'll let you take it away.
No, that was wonderful. It was such a pleasure to listen to you both. And Varshini, we're you know, your concluding message there, I can't help but think, you know, if we could get, you know, kids to have the same feelings you had when you were their age, you know, and grow a whole bunch more of you, that would be our role, right? You know, so we're going to go in the cloning business. No, I liked so much your conversation about the importance of feeling it all and it needing to come from the heart. And I think, you know, that's a good place for all of us to be thinking about, you know, to be there. And it was just pretty inspirational to listen to you tonight. So thank you both. We really appreciate it. And all I can say is keep on doing it.
Thank you. Yeah. Thank you so much, Marie and Neil and Karen and Miriam. This was it was really special. I feel sad that we couldn't be in person, just gathered around the dinosaur, but it's, you know, maybe another next time. And yeah, it was just really special for me to be a part of this conversation.
That's
so
great.
Thank you.
Well, thank you all. And for all of you listening out there, we hope to see you at a future event. So take care now. Good night.
Okay.
Night.